Hello and welcome to the One-on-One Podcast. If you're enjoying the show, consider signing up for the Patreon. There you get ad-free content, early access, exclusive episodes, and monthly supporter hangouts. You can find it at patreon.com/the One-on-One Podcast. If you don't like the subscription-based models, there are other ways of supporting the show that are linked in the description. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the One-on-One Podcast with your host, Juan Ayala.
See, it's trying to interrupt. Somebody was aware of what they were disengaging, and what I'm trying to say is that's why the sword and the stone, in my opinion, speculation, was placed where it was at, so that it's a marker for here, right here in this spot, is the intersection of the telluric current, okay, of the three telluric currents. This is where it's at, and I'm going to be presenting this in some future works, but I have found evidence that this sword imagery, sword and stone imagery, may have been dispersed in all sorts of places, and the code is, if the sword is embedded in the stone, then the energy is locked if it's in another position, and I'm still working that. But in my opinion, the sword being in the stone, we know that's from Arthurian legend and from the Disney Once and Future King movie. The actual underlying meaning is, in my opinion, that it's, to those who will understand, that's where they can find that intersection.
Welcome back to another episode of the One-on-One Podcast. Make sure to follow the show on social media at the One-on-One Podcast. All the links in the description. Website tjojp.com. And enough of that. Today we have Walter Bosley with us. Walter, how you doing today, man? It's the first time I've ever talked to you.
Yeah, pretty good. I'm looking forward to this one.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I know you're out of town, so we'll rock and roll here. And I wanted to talk to you about your book. The first book I ever came across of your work, Latitude 33, Key to the Kingdom, the Arcane Science and Hermetic Engineering of the Happiest Place on Earth. How long ago did you write that? That was a while ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, I researched it started researching it in 2006 and wrote it through 2007, and it was published in early 2008, I believe. Of course, based on or inspired by an experience I had back in 1981. But yeah, I wrote it 2006, 07.
And for those that don't know about you, Walter, can you give us a quick, brief outline of you and where people can find your work if you've got a website? Because I know you also do publishing as well.
Sure. Yeah, I spent 20 years in the U.S. national security community between multiple organizations, and when I finished that, walked away from that, I had founded a publishing company just a few years before I left my profession, and so I focused on the publishing after 20 years in national security, and it really took off once I started doing nonfiction. It started out as a adventure fiction, retro kind of stuff, pulp type of adventure, and I released the Disneyland book as my first work of nonfiction, and I'll tell you, I think I've come to about 14 nonfiction books on seemingly disconnected topics, but they all have threads that connect them, involving history and occult murder and all sorts of stuff. But I can be found at the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. Every Sunday is my live stream, and also there is lostcontinentlibrary.com. That's my publishing company name, but my books are all print on demand. They can be found at lulu.com or Amazon or Barnes and Noble.
Awesome, and I think I've read this book 3 times already. So it actually inspired an episode I did on Parallel 33. And I came across this because I was researching. I do a lot of research on Florida because I'm in
Uh-huh.
Florida and we have Disney
Okay.
World, the most magical place on earth. And
Yeah.
so I was trying to find some connections with Disney and just the usual cult connections that one can
Right.
assume that they had, because I mean they're very powerful people, and here Disney World is on the 28th parallel, and according to Michael Hoffman, that's the 28th degree, and Templarism is the degree of the sun, and we
Mhm.
are in the sunshine state. I believe that Disneyland is in Orange County, Disney
Mhm.
World is in Orange County over here as well. So you have
Yeah.
that, like, that double pillar, the two pillars in between America pretty much. And
Right.
you had a sort of synchronicity, and I wanted to ask you, what are your views on synchronicities, especially when it comes to doing research? Do you take them seriously? Do you not? Because some people might think synchronicities are a bunch of BS. What are your views on synchronicities?
Those are the people who either have never really experienced them or they're in denial, because that stuff's very, very real, and they're there. They are part of the fabric of our whole reality, and really, once you see them, you recognize them as they happen. Okay. Almost like you can't really honestly ignore them. However, you still shouldn't let them drive you crazy, because it can, if you put too much energy into it. Just recognize that synchronicity is something that generally tries to point you to something you should pay attention to, something that is significant. Now, the way I approach it as a nonfiction writer, right, and a professional investigator, is that I try never to propose a hypothesis or claim something based on synchronicity alone. I will certainly discuss the synchronicities involved with a particular thing, but generally I try to find the material or documentary or witness evidence to further back up what the synchronicities point to. So that's what I use them as. They're road signs. Um,
Yeah, and I use deja vu and synchronicities as a sort of, I look at
sure,
it as life leaving you breadcrumbs, whatever this life is,
sure, yeah,
or
yeah,
reality,
exactly,
leaving
yeah,
you little breadcrumbs, and if you choose to follow it, then so be it. If not, then whatever. And I look at deja vu as like, if this is an echo in space and time, then I've done this before. That means I'm on the right track. That's how usually I look at deja vu and synchronicities, right? And then sometimes you see the numbers over and over again on your watch or whatever it is.
sure.
So in 1980, you had this experience at the
81.
81.
Yeah, I think it's 81, or is it 80 in the book?
Yeah, it says in 1980 I was first introduced to the phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah. So I get them mixed up because in 81 I was having more experiences that were kind of off the chart, but we'll trust the book because I was closer to the data when I wrote the book.
So you had this experience with this figure at the
Yeah,
park at Disneyland,
yeah.
and was this some sort of egregore? What were you initiated, Walter? I mean, I have so many questions. Do you feel like you were initiated? Are we initiated whenever we go into these parks?
Um, yeah. Except to that question, I'd like to kind of humorously say yes to all of it, because as you know in the book, I propose four possibilities for the experience I had. Um, as far as in my research, I haven't done a deep dive on Disney World. I know of some interesting things about it, like you pointed out the Hoffman thing and the 28th degree. There is a gentleman named Sesh Hari who's done some very interesting geomorphological
The line of Dundee. Yeah.
analysis of Florida and the Disney park and everything. But as I've done more of the deep dive on Disneyland, So I don't know if I can't speak to the experience of going to Disney World as a ritual because I've never been to Disney World. So I don't know. I could walk in there and have a doozy of an experience. Now, Disneyland, as you know, having read the book, I think that the psychotronic device that I propose Disneyland was constructed to be was disengaged in 1982 when they redesigned Fantasyland. Rather than a ritual, I think it's more of it's the words are escaping me. It's intended to be an experience. Psychotronic is the word that keeps coming up, but I really do believe, I am convinced that the man who I think did this, who appears to have engineered Disneyland in this way, I really think that he intended this experience of Disneyland as a device merely to enhance the experience of visiting the park, that it was not intended as some type of ritual. However, enlightenment, right, and exposure to things could conceivably happen if you accept the hypothesis of it as a psychotronic device.
Are you familiar with the Pythagorean palace idea?
It's been a while. Refresh my memory.
So a Pythagorean palace is a building that is modeled after Pythagorean principles, and this is during the Renaissance. And the idea being that if a building adheres to certain principles, it is able to encapsulate within that building a higher level of consciousness. So extrapolate that out. I mean, look at, right, Seshari's work, also very influential to me. I've been reading the Handprint of Atlas, amazing work. And the idea that if you extrapolate it out, you can have a park built to certain adherences, right? Look at the Vatican, look at Washington, D.C., look at all these different places. Now, how you're saying when we walk through these gates, there are these places have cult-like followings. They quite literally shape people's I mean, look at Fulcanelli and the Mystery of the Cathedrals when they were walking into these cathedrals, pictorial magic, right? The images have more resonance with you than the actual words that you're able to read, right? And they do it for the peasant class, right? The uninitiated, the uneducated. So maybe perhaps because you said that it was C.V. Wood, the one that designed it, and then Disney World, actually, Walt Disney had died before it actually was built, and although Disney, and I know this is later on in the book, was not a Mason, his brother was. From my research, I don't know if you're familiar with his brother. I don't even know what his brother's name is. Roy. Okay. So the idea being that if they build these places, right, you have the mystical toponymy, so you name it something powerful along a powerful line. And then you encapsulate it and use it as a sort of talisman, if you will, right? Because the carousel, right, carousel was a type of talisman. I mean, that was possibly charged. How you said it might have been the reason for why you met this Alfred character, which...
Right, because I propose that the carousel is the key, the key element of the machinery that is Disneyland, right? Its rotation draws the energy up from the intersection of those three telluric currents, and then its rotation then spins out and disperses that energy, right, throughout the park, as described. And certainly, I think that C.V. Wood was consciously aware of the potential for any kind of illumination beyond what, as I described, just the enhancing the experience of the park, right? So certainly someone who is, let's say, at that crossroad in life, right? Or if just their stars fall into place, if they conceivably were to be in the park when this was functional, certainly illumination and things more than just a nice day could happen.
Yeah, and I went to Disney World not long ago, and I took a picture of this. I'll probably pull it up here in a little bit. I took a picture of this thing. It looked like a Stargate. I mean, it was
Hmm.
quite literally. It looked like a Stargate. And at the end of the day, they played like
Hmm.
they did this whole fireworks show. But it was very, again, very weird. And they are the most one of the most powerful companies in the world. I mean, for a
Yeah,
reason. So using
yeah.
these things in combination, in conjunction, because you talk about how CV Wood went on to do other parks that weren't quite as recognizable.
He went and worked on several other parks, most of which don't exist today.
Mm.
And I wouldn't say obscurity, but he died almost in obscurity. he,
Mm-hmm.
he ended up in, I think he appeared in a B movie, and you know, a footnote. For the longest time, the Disney company would never mention him in their history and their literature. That was only a fairly recent development. And when I say recent, I think in the last 15 to 20 years, they finally admitted there was another guy who engineered the park. Going back to what you said about the Pythagorean Palace, that kind of reminds me of also the concept of memory theater. Are you
Yes.
familiar with that? Yeah. And how memory theater can really
and
activate some
and
things.
your energy is attached to that area of the model, right?
Yeah.
So if you have the simulacra of the, because we know that they make the little models that they do, right? And then if they're able to, I mean, Seshari talks about it, where the adept, the magi, the magus, whoever is able to tap into that, and we see this in shows like Stranger Things, or right where she's able to
Yeah.
see the picture of the Russian guy and is able to see where he's at in this astral realm, watery
Yeah.
like type of thing, very Gnostic.
Yeah.
So again, I mean, I do believe that's part of it. And maybe perhaps these
Uh-huh.
places I would propose are places of energy harvesting in some sort of way, because just
The,
how go ahead.
mhm. No, no, go ahead and finish your thought, because I do have a interesting, you know, perspective to share with you on the common assumption about
Mm.
what Disney Corporation might be doing with the parks. But
So I've always said that religions have their own pools of people that they are able to tap into in a way. So
yes,
if you initiate people, again, I mean, let's be honest, everyone listening, that these are initiations, because Christianity, they'll focus like, oh, magic is bad, but if you read the stories of Jesus Christ, I mean, that was magic. I mean, I grew up Pentecostal Christian, where they dance around and do backflips and speak in tongues. So the
sure,
supernatural, right? It's like, oh well, magic is bad. What are you doing, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
this
Well, Christianity. There's Christianity, and then there's what most proclaimed Christians practice, and that's really could be called churchianity.
mm.
And they're not exactly the same.
So yes, the idea of harvesting energies. Right now, we have them on both sides of the country. They're in Japan too, I believe. Right? They have a Disney
Oh,
Japan.
sure. Japan, France.
Oh wow.
Um, yeah, and I'm jealous. The one in Japan, my gosh, just the Adventureland part alone is like its own park, and so much better than the one we have in California. But a lot of people. What I was going to say was what brought to mind was that a lot of people will ask me and kind of make the assumption that there was Walt Disney, and then there's the Disney company as we know it, today, especially. Um, and they would assume that, wow, if Disneyland and maybe whatever was done to Disney World engineering wise is some type of psychotronic device, they must be using it for nefarious purposes. But when you read the book closely, and you remember that I argue that the device that CV Wood engineered into the Anaheim Park, in my opinion, was disengaged in 1982, and it has not been active since then. And we've seen a decline in the physical quality of the park, the experience, the quality of the experience has been a decline. And at the same time, you have seen the Disney Corporation grow into this monster, this rat almost. And really, in my research, all the nefarious things that you can point to connected with Disney, this all started long after Walt was dead. This all started as they pushed the family out. And, really, it goes back to the Michael Eisner era when he first started running, Disney. When they redesigned Fantasyland, they moved the carousel back several feet, 30 something feet. It'll be intriguing to find out if the exact measurement is 33 feet, right? But they moved it off the intersection. And so therefore it's disengaged. And in my opinion, the device was a positive thing. It created positive energy.
The happiest place on earth.
Yeah. It left people, it would illuminate the mind and the consciousness. So I think that kind of the illuminated mind is less prone to be controlled by or dominated. Okay. So they don't want a bunch of illuminated minds. You're right. They want a captive audience that they can just, I like how you put it, they can just mine their emotions and their psyche. Now, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, let's say that Disneyland, within the context of this psychotronic device, up until 1982 was baseball. Baseball is a mystical game. Okay. It's a mystical game, a mystical sport. There's a lot of Freemasonry symbolism in baseball because it was invented by an American Freemason right after the Civil War. And the game itself, the pace is different. Yes. But it is a very mystical sport that works on the subconscious in a very positive way. Now, after 1982, when this device that is Disneyland was disengaged, Disneyland went from being baseball to being football, just a very base course, just back and forth, get a touchdown, just boom, boom, boom. Football is far lower in intellect than baseball is. And so it became football, so to speak, of the psyche, as opposed to baseball on the psyche. And I would argue that the big monster Disney Corporation, it wants more of a football psyche type of mass to work with and draw from, because they're more automatons, they're more base, they're just more easy to manipulate. So they didn't want to be illuminating the minds of their guests and the fans and such. No, they want a simpler mind to control. And that's my view on the Disney Corporation versus, its early days, if any of that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I think you called it a rat, but it's a mouse, Walter. Remember, it's Mickey Mouse.
Oh, that's right. It's a mouse.
And on that topic, so I'm going to be jumping around here a little bit.
Sure.
The idea that they're also able to use this energy to uphold and birth into reality egregores. I mean, would you consider Mickey Mouse an egregore of some type, that he is living, right, almost like this? And they've also manifested him, if you really look at it, because people dress up in these costumes and they participate in this microcosm of a macro, right? The microcosm being Disneyland.
Here's how I would put it. It's an artificial egregore.
It's a homunculus.
It's a synthetic egregore. It's artificial. The true egregore would be what would manifest by the individual psyche. And if you recall in the book, I wonder who the Alfred was that I experienced. And if the Alfred I experienced was an egregore, that was, what I personally experienced. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's from an individual mind. So in my view,
your friend saw him, right?
Pardon?
Your friends saw him with you, right?
Yes, they did. So that could have been, that puts it in the column of, well, maybe it wasn't just a personal vision. Obviously, it was somebody who was visible to my two other friends, which then points to either a doppelganger, meaning in the sense of a double, where a man who is not the Alfred but looks identical to him, so as a trigger for me years later to key on Alfred Watkins, or instead of just a double, My favorite of the four that I propose, of course, which is probably the wildest and least possible, is that it was Alfred Watkins transported through space and time from England in 1928 to Disneyland in 1980. That's my personal favorite. That's what I would really love it to have been. But I would say that the real egregore is something that the corporate Disney would prefer not to deal in. They would rather have an artificial egregore that they can plant like an MK Ultra false narrative in the minds of the masses.
Do you know the definition of corporation, Walter?
I within this context, educate me.
The etymological origins is an artificially created persons by a group of people. That's what the definition of corporation literally means.
Okay,
corpo,
yeah, I've heard
right?
that. Yeah, makes
So
sense.
think about that, right? You have this corporation that is Disney, and then you attach sigils to it. So all these symbols and
Sure.
and their pantheon. Let's get into their pantheon because we're talking about Mickey Mouse, but we have all these other stories that you talk about as well, that they have darker meanings and darker connotations, I guess, right? The original stories, and they take them, they kind of invert them in a way in order to suit their needs with their people. And then you have this entire pantheon of characters, movies, stories that have the Disney twist on them, except they're not as dark. But does that negate the fact that they were dark to begin with? How does that work? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, superficially, of course, what the Disney experience, right, is a palatable mythology, palatable to think about it. It was in Southern California, which was the golden place to go to in the 1950s, and it was first, presented to a very American 1950s American population, and so everything then was still in that afterglow of the war, right, where the economy was booming and everything, appeared to be hunky-dory. Within the next 10 years, we learned that it was not. But for the context of the time, these were originally dark stories that, of course, were presented in that again, palatable light that was just the thing in those days. And remember, too, not that he did it for evil and nefarious purposes, but Walt Disney was a shrewd. He could be a shrewd businessman and producer specifically, and he knew he was onto a good formula with this Disney version of these things. People liked it, and really, it was all about entertaining people. He liked fun, light entertainment. So it's just as much a reflection of the man as it was the time, So I think that, however, the fact that a lot of these stories started out as the really dark Grimm's fairy tales and other kind of myths and stuff, that within the collective psyche, we sense that there is something darker under the surface of the stories as Disney presented them to us. And I think he hinted at that. Look at his version of Snow White. There's parts of Snow White that just scare the hell out of children. Look at Sleeping Beauty with the dragon and the imagery of hell and such. These were still the hints that there was something darker going on here. And all it takes is for an interested viewer to then seek out those original stories and see the original versions and fill in the gaps, fill in the blanks. But it could be that it was still maybe an unintended result. It was still, as you viewed these Disney versions, something in the collective subconscious, right, of our culture and society was aware of the darker versions, aware of the darker connotations of the events in the story, and it's still, intended or not, activated something. Even from viewing the more happy, lighter versions, the subconscious was still processing this.
Part of the Pythagorean palace lore is, and I've done an episode on architect as magician, because back then architects were looked as sort of magicians. Architecture back then, what the art of it was, right? The architect with his stylus, that was his wand. It was a sort of divination, because they needed to predict if 100 years from now that foundation was still going to hold that building. But one important aspect, which really applies to everything, if you take it, and extrapolate it, the idea of what they call occulted scaffolding. When the architect is drawing this building, he's making lines that he will later erase. Well, the intention that goes behind these things, that the occulted aspects, right, that are not seen behind the scenes, also matter, and that also influences how you're saying this subconscious realm. And if we get into the archetypes and Carl Jung, and how the collective, that might be the other dimension, that collective conscious, where everybody comes together and these things come forth, whatever it is, because they manifest themselves always in these stories, and you see them over and over again, the hero with 1,000 faces, and there's a reason for that, right?
Well, a couple of things on what you just said there. When you go back to the magic, the architect as magician, I think you said, I have experienced this personally with landscape architecture. There is a shopping plaza near where I live, out in a town called Rancho Cucamonga, and this place is called Victoria Gardens. And during my Empire of the Wheel, that's a trilogy of books I've written on what I think were occult murders over 100 years ago. During my investigation on all that, which was started as a follow-up to the Disneyland book, I discovered that there is this ritual pathway embedded in this shopping plaza called Victoria Gardens. You start out by passing through two palm trees that for all the world are Jachin and Boaz, the pillars, and on and so forth. I've talked about this on my own channel and stuff, and I've taken people on tours of this and shown them. So what you're talking about with architecture can also be applied very much to landscaping. And I think both, by the way, what you're talking about, of course, were applied to Disneyland and certainly Disney World. But when you mention about how something will be drawn but can be erased, you have to really go out there, okay, on the hypothetical limb, of speculation. You have to ask yourself, the architect draws something. Are we sure that what he erases from the paper is completely erased on the plane of intention? In other words, are those features that were erased from the paper, are they on some other plane of the full spectrum of reality? Are they actually still there?
I would say yes.
Only through the experience of, say, the carousel device being reactivated, the psychotronic device, do they then come into your visionary plane? It's like in the movie The Shadow, the one from the 90s, where the mist lifts and he can see the big temple there that he couldn't see before. And so with architectural magic, is it possible that what is erased from the paper is actually there on that magical level? That's an idea that intrigues me.
Yeah, the actual architecture itself becomes a talisman. It becomes this magically charged thing.
And can you pass into that dimension where what was erased on paper and what was apparently not built, can you pass into that dimension where it is physically there? I don't know. That's an intriguing question too.
Absolutely. And he goes on to say in Pythagorean palaces that it's usually the initiated are the ones that are aware of this occulted scaffolding and these occulted areas within these palaces, these Pythagorean
Mhm.
palaces. And the idea that we have here, I want to talk about the paranormal in Disney a little bit,
Sure.
how you talked about how some people were afraid to be on certain rides certain times of the day,
The
and
employees. Yeah.
because these energies get stuck there, right? The land itself had a history as well, and you said it's almost in like a bowl, right? Like in the shape of a
Yeah.
bowl. So again, we have this
Yeah.
resonance.
It was on 160 acres of citrus grove property, and this one particular family owned most of it, if not all of it. An interesting side note: the son in that family, he was a kid when the Disney brothers bought the property and Disneyland was built, and he was a lifelong employee of Disneyland. After that, they gave him a job, and he worked there for the rest of his life. But yeah, it was, and this is flat ground. If you've ever, been to Southern California and you're in Anaheim, it's all flat terrain. And they did dig the park area. They dug a bowl, which you can see it on maps. It's kind of an upside down, with north at the top. It's an upside down triangle with rounded corners. Well, that's all sets down into a bowl. And the edge that is at the original ground level is where they put the railroad track, where the berm of the park is. And when you ride the Disneyland Railroad around the park, that's the original boundary of the park. But yeah, it's down in a bowl physically.
Interesting is again this idea of the energy resonating and being spit back out into the world, because I mean they've quite literally transformed the world. And then I don't know if it was you who said it or who it was, but Disney World as the eternal World's Fair. Was that you that I heard say that about before? Because
I think I've said that about Disneyland,
yeah.
because Disneyland being the original, but essentially, the model of a Disney, Magic Kingdom is, yeah, you're right. It is,
And the pieces that they were using, the equipment, it was coming from expositions from these world fairs. And he was
yeah,
like,
some of the like It's a Small World was first built for the World's Fair, and Carousel of Progress, which was in Tomorrowland for a long time in Disneyland. That was something Disney did for a World's Fair, and this is where they practice. This is where Walt himself would kind of test ride concepts and things like that. Now, to go back to what you said about the energy, what I point out in Latitude 33 is, because the park is in a bowl, it is my opinion, I could be wrong, that the energy which the carousel is drawing up and then spreading through the park, it doesn't leave the park. It goes up the walls of the berm and then comes back down into the park. So it's contained, this magical energy, because back during the years when this thing was engaged, it really, you could tell that, once you left the park and got out beyond that berm out to where the parking area was, you sensed it. You were back in the real world, and it literally felt different. Whereas after that, the
and
magic was gone.
I didn't, correct me if I'm wrong, and I put here when the biggest impact of the fair had on the world was the White City, especially at night. It was the first time in accepted history where such a large city landscape was artificially illuminated. And I put here as a note, they were quite literally the Illuminati, right?
Yeah.
The Illuminators. So correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't C.V. Wood go on to work in something about the mind and consciousness later on? Was that him?
Yeah, he was involved with that before
Okay.
Disneyland and after. But he was a friend and associate of a philanthropist named Tom Swift, a wealthy guy who, at the time, in the 50s, was known for being avidly interested in stories of the Yeti, the abominable snowman, and went on the search for him. But he and Stevie Wood and some others, they were the core founders of an organization called the Mind Sciences Foundation, which was getting into the psychic potential of the human mind. And so, yeah, C.V. Wood was really into this stuff. He was a personal friend of a psychic known at the time named Peter Herkos, who was on TV and appeared in movies and stuff. And so he was in that milieu, very much interested in any kind of stuff like this. So it when you learn about C.V. Wood, you realize it was no surprise that he would have attempted to engineer Disneyland into something like a psychotronic device. It makes sense.
And maybe it might have been why they kind of gave him the cold shoulder after the fact, that they didn't want to maybe.
That was, Walt didn't like the fact that C.V. Wood had started billing himself as the man who built Disneyland. And because, it was Walt's vision. My thing is, Walt Disney was not a bad man. Walt Disney liked to smoke. He liked his whiskey. He liked to cuss like a sailor sometimes. The man was not a perfect human being. There's not a damn one of us on this world that is. But he was not. Some of the most ridiculous things are said about him. He was a basically flawed guy, but he was a good man. And he did have an ego. I mean, come on, he was Walt Disney. Look at what he built. So that was really the impetus for why C.V. Wood was fired. And kind of, hey, knock it off. It's Walt. So it was an ego thing, an ego clash.
There's only room for one demiurge around here, and yeah, right. when these kings and elites would have their palaces built, they believed them to be alive. They were the demiurges of these palaces. And I talk about Henry Plant, how he calls one of his hotels his pet. Right, here's my pet, and it's kind of giving it like this connotation, like, is it alive? Is it breathing? I mean, they would think so back then. I mean, that's how they looked at it. So sure. This idea of like, hey, there's only room for one of us. What's the saying? It's like that. It's not big enough for both of us, or whatever. However it goes. Yeah. So let's see here. Disney's father. Let's get into alchemy here. At the because I like the fact that I love the way you broke down alchemy. I mean, I always have trouble breaking down alchemy, and I always tell people it's like interdimensional. And Elias Disney, I immediately thought about Elias Artista, and I mean, he was an artist. I mean, if you know the lore of Elias Artista, that's what I thought about when I thought about the Alfred that you met. I said, right, this. If it is an alchemical vessel that Disney would be, right, you go in and you're spit back out you're transmuted in the process of this experience that you're having in this park. Well, what if certain people are chosen, Walter? And that's why I asked you at the beginning, were you initiated? Because this interdimensional alchemist that leads his pupils and gives them the thumbs up, like, hey, you're on the right track to achieve that magnum opus.
Well, interesting question. I have talked about and written about an experience I had in December of '79, just a couple of months before this experience at Disneyland. And I have described that experience as an enlightenment or an illumination. And basically, in a nutshell, it was, I woke up one Sunday morning, December of 1979, and something was different. And the first thing I did was I held my hands up and I looked at them closely, and my first thought was, these are not my hands. And I went through the house, and it was, there were my sisters, my mom, my dad. This was my home, and stuff. But I was different, and this just had happened in the night, apparently. Now I since have some pretty wild hypotheses on what it was, but the result was whatever it actually facilitated this. Yes, was something that propelled my consciousness and awareness forward. And I've never thought about it exactly the way you put it, in that what happened to me that night, that day, might have been the thing that opened up the door to my experience at Disneyland a couple months later. I like that. This is why I love, talking with people who have read the book and pondered my experience, because there's always something new that the experiencer will overlook that helps provide a greater grasp and understanding on it. I like that suggestion. It's possible, I think.
Yeah, because you get into alchemy here. You talk about, let me pull it up here, just towards the end a little bit.
And I will say this real quickly, that the man who became my mentor professionally and mystically. It taught me things like necromancy, as well as getting me into the FBI and in my national security career. That's a whole other discussion, how those two are married. But he did not begin his overt mentorship of me until I had the 1979 experience, until I had the experience at Disneyland, until I had in January of 81 the most incredibly vivid dream I ever had, that parts of it continued to come true for 30 years. And several of these, I guess you'd say, initiatory experience or advancement experiences. And then eventually he emerged as a mentor who, pushed me deeper into the weird stuff. So maybe Disneyland was part of an initiation.
Interesting, because if you look at it, how true do you think it is that the idea, because I know there was a part in here where they talked about how Walt Disney was at that apartment up in I think near the castle or something, where he
had there's an apartment up in the castle, there's an apartment above the fire station on Main Street, and there's one above the Pirates of the Caribbean.
The idea, have you heard the conspiracy that he froze his head or something like that? Did you hear about that?
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Everybody's heard about that. I don't think there's anything to that at all. I mean, that'd be cool if he'd done something like that. But here's what's interesting about Walt himself. He really, for all of the stuff we talk about, and for his imagination, he himself was not known, not that I could find anywhere, really like into occult things. I mean, for instance, the Haunted Mansion was his vision, but it was just from a fun, superficial, spooky, a fun, spooky old, carnival haunted house on steroids kind of thing. However, he became friends with Walter Knott, who founded Knott's Berry Farm, and Walter Knott was into these paranormal.
So with the old town, the cowboy town or something like that he transplanted.
Oh yes, Tombstone, the classic Tombstone. The several of the buildings in what's called Calico Ghost Town, out not far from where I live in Southern California. Several of those buildings were in the city of Tombstone in 1881 during the famous gunfight at the OK Corral, and they were bought and transported and reconstructed in Calico Ghost Town, which was built by Walter Knott and owned by Knott's Berry Farm for years. And I've known some Native American paranormal investigators who the rangers in the park won't talk about Calico from a paranormal perspective, but the natives, the Native American organization that's located right next door, they will talk about what they've seen and encountered in Calico Ghost Town as regards spirits and things like that. But Walt himself, it's interesting. Walt was just not into the things that, like, as we described, the man who, was the engineer of his park. He just wasn't into that stuff.
Yeah, like as far as evidence, right? Because I mean, we could talk about because if they are, because Elias Artista, I'm thinking, and I go, was maybe perhaps Walt Disney, right? Like this seventh son of a seventh son or something, where he was meant to be like the one to carry on the torch and build forward. So, that's what I'm thinking when I'm reading and I'm seeing these names, because I've already had them in my mind, and so that's where my mind goes to. And I love the way
you remember in the book that I talk about that Elias Disney was one of the construction workers who helped build the White City of the 1893 World's Fair that you mentioned earlier. Yes. Walt grew up hearing about that. The whole country did, because that 1893 Chicago World's Fair, I think a ridiculously high percentage of the American population went to that fair during the year it was open. It was just the most phenomenal event of its kind at that time. And as I talk about it in the book, of course, it influenced not just parks and amusement parks for, decades after that. Mm-hmm. It also influenced how cities were laid out and designed, municipally.
Interesting. And there was also, well, the 1893 one, at least there was murders going on around that one, but
Oh yeah, yeah.
the
H.H. Holmes.
yes, but yeah, absolutely. Again, it reminds me going back to this idea of going there as some sort of ritual, and then you had all the elites there, all the biggest names, J.P. Morgan, you had Nikola Tesla, you had what was it, Westinghouse, I think it is.
Westinghouse, yeah, Westinghouse was
Edison, all those guys were there, and I mean, yeah, that would make a lot of sense. So, and the thing about this, I always reference alchemy, and I talk about alchemy a lot because I think it pertains to everything in reality, because anything that is an exchange of energy is alchemy. So when you're going to these places and you're giving your money, that time and energy that you put into that money, you're exchanging it for this experience, right? Welcome to Disney World or Disneyland or wherever you are. Have a good time and enjoy yourself. But you're doing that transference of energy. And so I love the way you put it here. Alchemy has 4 categories or levels: physical, biological, psychological, and transcendental. So this idea that these places can have an effect on these different areas, right? Physically, they make us feel good. They tire us out. Biologically, I mean, they're helping you release different chemicals in your brain. Psychologically, it's making you feel and you're absorbing these things. And then transcendental, where I forgot where it was that I read, but it talked about how you have, right, you always have this spirit body who's attached to you by a tether, right? This tether. And I always tell people who don't believe in the occult, they go, I don't believe in any of that stuff. I go, that's fine. You don't believe in it, but your soul does, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it believes in you. You know, hey, think about what you just described, how you have this other part of you or this other you that is tied to you by a tether, right? Now go back to Disney's Peter Pan and his shadow, and in the story from both, you know, and J.M. Barrie's original book and you know, they chose to keep this in the Disney movie where his shadow leaves him and he has to sew it to his body. Remember, that's what Wendy is doing. She's reattaching his shadow. And there's your symbolism of what you just described right there in one of the original classic Disney films.
Very, very Jungian, right? Facing the shadow, and what does the shadow do? It reveals to you the secrets of the secrets, right? The darkest and everything. So absolutely, I haven't seen the movie. Okay, so I don't know about it.
Oh wow, you haven't seen the original Disney Peter Pan? Oh,
Walter, there's a lot of movies I haven't seen, and I had a co-host that would always give me shit for that. Like, oh, you haven't seen Indiana Jones? And I'm like, no, I haven't seen the original. It's like, so there's a lot of movies that I have not seen. So,
well, you got something to catch up with.
Yeah, I have here The Shadow, 1990s, and now we have Peter Pan, the original, and I'll watch it with my son and wife or something. So
he'll love it. Yeah.
We have alchemy, right? I love the way you broke alchemy down and how you described
it. Well, that's standard. When you look at any standard text on alchemy, those are the categories that are, you know, are long known to, you know, be put forth as how you break it down. So.
And transcendental alchemy is what I believe my investigation has uncovered at Disneyland. This level of the science is designed to raise man from the state of nature to a state of grace. So again, this transmutation of people real time. And I mean,
I believe that is exactly what C.V. Wood was consciously intending to do with Disneyland as he designed it.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it would make sense because that's an interesting background to have and be involved. And you called it, I have it here where the name for the elemental engineering, I believe it was called. And I have a friend of mine who he's talked about it, these elemental technologies and the way, right, in a geomantic form, where if you lay these things out, that's alchemy too. If you lay things out in a certain geometric pattern, you unlock things in reality. How you're saying, what if this carousel and right, it was replaced with the sword in the stone, wasn't it? After the fact,
as near my measurements, my calculations and analysis of physical Disneyland I'm convinced that where the sword in the stone is located in Fantasyland is where the center of where the carousel originally sat. As near as I can tell from really looking at the old photos and looking at now and doing the measurements and stuff. And I think that was on purpose. See, I think that there was somebody involved with this redesign of Fantasyland, even if it was only one person. There was somebody involved with that redesign that knew damn well what they were doing when they disengaged.
Walter, I think we lost you. Did your phone die?
I'm sorry. Are we good? We didn't get disconnected?
No, we're good. Yeah, you just blacked out there for a second. You're getting too close to the truth, Walter.
I thought I had disconnected incoming calls, but one got through. So
the one to tell you to stop talking about it.
Yeah, and here's the funny thing: the phone call was coming in from Los Angeles, which is just right up the road from Disneyland. But that's another discussion. So, as I was saying, I think somebody.
There it goes again. That somebody is calling Walter right now.
I apologize for it. They're trying to tell me to stop. Anyway, see, it's trying to interrupt. Somebody was aware of what they were disengaging, and what I'm trying to say is that's why the sword and the stone, in my opinion, speculation, was placed where it was at, so that it's a marker for here, right here in this spot is the intersection of the telluric current. Okay, of the three telluric currents, this is where it's at. And I'm going to be presenting this in some future works, but I have found evidence that this sword imagery, sword and stone imagery, may have been dispersed in all sorts of places. And the code is, if the sword is embedded in the stone, then the energy is locked. If the sword is pointing down to the stone, then the energy is locked. If it's in another position, and I'm still working that, but in my opinion, the sword being in the stone, we know that's from Arthurian legend and from the Disney, Once and Future King movie. But the actual underlying meaning is, in my opinion, that it's, to those who will understand, that's where they can find that intersection. So, and again, I think this was done on purpose because they wanted to change the energy of the park. They wanted to change how they would harvest, as you put it, the energy of the people coming to the park. It became a much cruder, less, not a good intention thing.
Do you think maybe there was a fight going on, Walter, of the good guys versus the bad guys? How you're saying, because it changed after it was handed down to this more.
I will tell you that I think the bad guys, so to speak, were very glad when Lillian, Walt's widow, finally passed, because boy, she was a staunch critic of some of the nonsense that the corporation would do and attempt to do. And so I think what we don't know about the conflict that you just alluded to, I think what we don't know about that might tell the story on that. I think the family saw what was happening with corporate Disney taking the empire over. And my impression is that the Disney family was never really happy with what corporate Disney has done.
Yeah, exactly. And what I was talking about earlier is this envirotechnology, the envirotechnical, where they
envirotechnical, yeah,
yeah, and that and it goes back to this idea of this elemental technology, where we're able to lay things out in a certain fashion. And things happen, things manifest, et cetera, And to what you were talking about, it kind of reminded me of Paracelsus. Paracelsus talks about pictorial magic and how relating to alchemy. How he said that the only people who were able to interpret these things were the magus, or the alchemist, right, the spagyrist, who was able to see these things for what they were. And what you're talking about, how you see nods to this. Well, I was on a presentation last night where we talked about how they've watered these symbols down all the way down to colors, right?
Yeah.
So Mars, the god Mars, was the warrior, this strong, and then it turns into armor, turns into chainmail, turns into the sword type of thing. So again, they're speaking to you because that symbol is sympathetically, in a sympathetic magical way, is linked to that the original intention, because it goes back to the idea of the occulted scaffolding, and it even goes into the idea of what we're talking about, that once you visit these places, Walter, perhaps you are forever changed in some sort of way, in a sympathetic magical way, right? The law of contagion.
I think there's something to that, and that might be, part of what was in play at Disneyland when the device was engaged.
So let's see here. Yeah, I think that we can wrap it up on that, because I mean, that was a crash course really on the book. Just speeding through here on the notes that I had, and I really enjoyed it. And I did an episode that's coming out soon on that was, I gave you credit. I said this was inspired through Walter Bosley's work, and I get into environmental psychology and how, right, these things shape us. And Seshari talked. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I can come back when I can stay longer and we can really get into more of these points.
Yeah. And the idea, right, the world, the stage. And I love the way that Seshari puts it in his book, Handprint of Atlas, where, right, the entire world is this memory theater.
Yes.
And we're leaving.
That's a phenomenal book.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. And the way that you leave your imprint and you're charging these lines by traveling along them and being present. And I think that people don't understand these concepts, that architecture, I started researching the occult and all these things, and then I finally got into like, wait a minute, you can turn an entire building into a talisman, an amulet or something, right? Like, what in the world? So that's how I came across this. And Walter, I really enjoyed this. We'll do one again soon. Hopefully, I know you're a busy guy. You were a bit slippery to really, and people told me that you were slippery to nail down. I was like, yeah,
really?
I mean, I've hit him up, and it'll happen when it happens.
I've been told that I say yes to pretty much everybody. Sometimes nailing me down on the date can take a little while, but you'll eventually get me. So I would love to come back and talk more. You're right. This is just kind of an intro to where we could go further.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to share my research with you on Pythagorean palaces and everything, because that goes way deep. And Walter, where can people find you once again? What was your website? And I'll put that in the description as well. But can you let the people know?
Well, I have my publishing company is called Lost Continent Library, and there's lostcontinentlibrary.com. But you can see me every Sunday on my live stream at the Walter Bosley channel on YouTube. And my books are all available at lulu.com. They're print on demand. It's worth the wait. And, just so between all those places. Also on Friday nights, I do a radio show from 6 to 9 p.m. Pacific time on the Independent Broadcast Network at independent-broadcasting.com.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'd love to have you, when we do this again, talk about the airships, the mysterious airships.
Absolutely. That's a
get into
fantastic topic. I love that one too.
Walter, thank you so much. And
thank you.
Everyone, you can find me tjojp.com, at the One-on-One Podcast on all social media platforms. And again, as always, see you on the other side.